Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has just announced a Second Amendment summer where there will be a gun tax holiday, meaning no sales tax on people in Florida that buy firearms, ammunition, and firearm-related accessories. This is a very important development, but let's use this as an opportunity to talk about whether or not taxing guns in any instance is constitutional under the Second Amendment. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Box of Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America under the 2025 Gun News Awards out there in Las Vegas. Thank you all for your support, the fans, the followers, the subscribers. Thank you so much. Obviously, I could not have done it without you, and we hope to continue to improve and bring you the best information about the Second Amendment and how to defend our right to keep and bear arms and the rest of the Constitution as well. All right, folks, so here's the story out of Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis has announced that he has proposed a budget, which looks favorable, like it might get passed, for 2025 and 2026. Big budget. And as part of his budget proposal, he is including what he likes to call the Second Amendment Summer. Nice consonation there, by the way. This Second Amendment Summer would be a gun tax holiday. It's part of the Florida budget if it's passed and signed into law. And the idea here is that existing sales taxes that are generally applicable throughout the state of Florida on all sorts of items, including but not limited to firearms, ammunition, gun-related accessories, that during the time period of Memorial Day 2025 through July 4th, 2025, that would be a period of time where any sales taxes applicable otherwise to guns, ammo, and the like would be waived. You wouldn't have to pay that if you're buying a gun or whatnot in Florida during that period of Memorial Day through July 4th. Call Second Amendment Summer. Now, according to reports, this is a time period every year that's a little slow for gun sales. So to encourage people to exercise their fundamental right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment, Governor Ron DeSantis has proposing, as part of his budget, the Second Amendment Summer gun tax holiday. And I thought this would be, first of all, I completely support this idea. I don't think there should be taxes on firearms or anything related to guns. Like just a general matter, don't think there should be taxes on First Amendment related material like books, newspapers, magazines, and the like. But with this news, I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk a little bit about taxes generally under the Constitution and when taxes on a constitutional activity, such as buying guns, is constitutional and when it might not be constitutional. And I just want to talk briefly at the end about what's the story with NFA taxes. To begin with, the way to understand taxes when you're dealing with fundamental rights or constitutional rights is there's really two buckets for your purposes, two buckets. The first bucket is dealing with generally applicable sales taxes. And the second bucket is targeted sales taxes or targeted taxes on constitutionally protected activities. So what do I mean by this? Well, a tax on generally applicable activities that just happens to also include constitutionally protected activities is generally constitutional. So for example, if you have a sales tax in Florida that applies to buying or selling really any item, could be eggs, could be guns, could be books, could be at a restaurant, right? Could be any item. Saws, Home Depot goods, whatever you want to call it, Lowe's goods, doesn't matter. If you're dealing with a generally applicable sales tax that applies to all those items, those are generally considered constitutional because they're not targeting, they're not focusing on, they're not trying to discriminate against a constitutionally protected activity. In contrast, if you have a tax that is targeted toward or focused on a constitutionally protected activity, like buying books, religious activities, buying guns, buying ammo, these targeted taxes are likely almost always unconstitutional under basic black letter Supreme Court precedent. So let's just explain a little bit about how we got there. Let's go back to the year of our Lord 1983, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided the Minneapolis Star case. Now, the Minneapolis Star case, for those of you who've been following the Four Boxes Diner channel, are probably already familiar with this case. This is a case where the U.S. Supreme Court said that when the state of Minnesota went out there and had a targeted tax on ink, and not just any old ink, but a particular type of ink, the kind of ink that was specifically used by the newspaper industry to make newspapers, to print newspapers. That targeted tax on ink was viewed by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Minneapolis Star case as a clear violation of the Constitution because it was taxing a constitutionally protected rights in a targeted way and not a generally applicable way to all sorts of things. It was a targeted tax toward, again, ink that was special and used by newspaper printers. Okay? Now, we must remember to go back much further to the beginning of our country, a very famous decision, McCulloch versus Maryland. Then Chief Justice John Marshall had a very famous quote in that decision, very famous line in that decision, that says the power to tax is the power to destroy. That's right, the power to tax is the power to destroy. Chief Justice John Marshall, one of the most important justices in all of American history. He really kind of set the guidance, the framework, the methodology, the approach for judicial review of cases and for judicial review of laws and the like, and really started to create the modern federal judiciary. It was started really with John Marshall and this notion at the start of our country after the Constitution was ratified. Now, given the fact that the power to tax, the power to destroy, you can understand why courts and others are very concerned if you have the government try to laser focus on and tax a particular activity that is protected by the Constitution. So if you go back in time, or I should say move forward in time, to the 1980s with this Minneapolis Star case, the U.S. Supreme Court draws this distinction between generally applicable taxes that applies to all sorts of activities, including but not just limited to constitutional activities, versus targeted. Here's what the Supreme Court had to say about generally applicable taxes and why there is a general matter okay as a matter of constitutional law. Clearly, the First Amendment does not prohibit all regulation of the press. It is beyond dispute that the states and the federal government can subject newspapers to generally, listen carefully folks, to generally applicable economic regulations without creating constitutional problems. Cites to a whole series of cases. It goes on to say, though, that here, Minnesota, however, has not chosen to apply its general sales and use tax to newspapers. Instead, Minnesota has created a special tax that applies only to certain publications protected by the First Amendment. Although the state of Minnesota argues now that the tax on paper and ink is part of the general scheme of taxation, the use tax provision is facially discriminatory, singling out publications for treatment that is, to our knowledge, unique in Minnesota tax law. So you can see right there that the Supreme Court of Minneapolis Star is trying to draw the distinction between a generally applicable tax, a use tax, sales tax, versus a targeted tax, and is trying to point out in this case of Minneapolis Star, the state of Minnesota was trying to target newspapers, specifically the ink that those newspapers used. And this is a targeted tax, and newspapers obviously are very important for the First Amendment right to free speech, as well as, of course, the First Amendment right to a free press, which includes not just the ability to speak your mind, but also my right to hear what you have to say. Because remember, the right to free speech and the right to a free press really has two beneficiaries. It's the speakers that are conveying a message and content, as well as those that are the recipients or potential recipients of that speech, of that press, of that content. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court in Minneapolis Star went on to continue to explain this difference between generally applicable taxes versus targeted taxes on constitutional rights. Here's what they had to say. A power to tax differentially, as opposed to a power to tax generally, gives a government a powerful weapon against the taxpayer selected. When the state imposes a generally applicable tax, there is little cause for concern. we need not fear that a government will destroy a selected group of taxpayers by burdensome taxation if it must impose the same burden on the rest of its constituency. When the state, however, singles out the press, though, the political constraints that prevent a legislature from passing crippling taxes of general applicability are weakened, and the threat of burdensome taxes becomes acute. That threat can operate as effectively as a censor to check critical comment by the press, undercutting the basic assumption of our political system that the press will often serve as an important restraint on government. So again, you can see how the Supreme Court draws this distinction. And while we're on the tax thing, let me just make two final points and then we'll wrap up. Don't forget, whenever you're arguing that a targeted tax, and I would argue, by the way, that mandatory insurance on gun owners is the equivalent of a tax. But with that said, but we can talk about that in a separate video about insurance requirements and how that's a tax. It really is, right? But nevertheless, don't forget, if you're going to argue this, don't just argue the Minneapolis Star case from the 1980s, although it's very good. Don't forget to cite Harper versus the Board of Elections, where a $1.50 poll tax was deemed unconstitutional because the poll tax on voting was viewed as a targeted tax verboten, not allowed under the Constitution. So you always want to cite the Minneapolis Star and Harper versus Board of Elections when you're fighting targeted taxes on guns and ammunition and the like. And that leads to kind of my final point of something many of you are going to ask me, and I'm going to give you the answer. And that is, what's the story with the tax on National Firearms Act items? Why is it that we have to pay taxes on those items that fall within the National Firearms Act, the NFA? Well, here's the answer. For now, as of today, remember, this is not rainbows and unicorns. It's not wishful thinking. That's not why you come to this channel. Today, the items listed as NFA items, whether it be destructive devices, machine guns, suppressors, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, as of this moment in time, in the year of our Lord 2025, those items have not been deemed or found to be protected, constitutionally protected items under the Second Amendment. And because those are not deemed constitutionally protected items under the Second Amendment or otherwise, they can be taxed. Why? Because you have no constitutional right as of today under the law to acquire those items. So they can tax that like any other item where you don't have a constitutional right to. Let's say a hammer. So they can have a targeted tax on hammers, on chainsaws, on drills and drill bits, I presume. Not aware of any reason why you couldn't have a targeted tax on those items. Just like, why is that? Because those are not constitutionally protected, like, let's say, handguns are under Heller. So in light of what I just said, because those items identified as NFA items are right now the equivalent of a constitutionally unprotected object, such as a chainsaw or, again, a fire extinguisher or a lamp, whatever, they can be taxed in a targeted way because they're not constitutionally protected. And this targeted tax concept under Harper and Minneapolis Star assumes that the tax is targeting an item that is constitutionally protected, or the tax is targeting an activity that is constitutionally protected. And buying the items from the NFA, buying these NFA items, using these NFA items are not right now viewed as constitutionally protected under the Second Amendment, and therefore they can be taxed in a targeted way without running afoul of the Constitution. Do I agree with where we are in the law today? No, I don't. But again, we have to take one step at a time. And the next step we have to win, as I've explained before, is we got to get a clear precedent, which should be very easy, that AR-15s and semi-automatic rifles are protected arms under the Second Amendment. Then we want to make sure that magazine capacity limits are verboten, not allowed under the Second Amendment. And then we can start to move on from there to other NFA items. Although, with a side note, I do think suppressors is a particularly strong case, actually, to possibly be viewed as something that's constitutionally protected under the Second Amendment. We might be able to win that on a straight-up challenge. Those cases are percolating through the courts. We'll see what happens in the next couple of years, but I do think there's a shot to win that one dealing with suppressors. But again, the history of the future has yet to be written, so we'll see what happens. Okay, folks, hope you learned a little bit something about the Second Amendment, taxation, and constitutional law. Make sure you follow me on X at 4 Boxes Diner. Don't forget to subscribe both to the 4 Boxes Diner channel on YouTube and on Rumble, and I look forward to talking to all of you again very, very soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.